on voulait montrer également un extrait de Portrait de la jeune fille en feu. Donc c'est une scène où les personnages rient. C'est la scène du jeu de cartes. Donc deux scènes de Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, si tu veux bien projeter ça, Jérôme, s'il te plaît. Donc c'est une scène qui fait écho à plusieurs choses qu'on a dites. À la fois la question picturale dans cette scène de jeu de cartes. Je me demandais s'il y avait cette question des regards autour du jeu de cartes, parce que ça évoque aussi des tableaux. Et puis tout ce qui est dit évidemment sur la présence du regard masculin qui est toujours déjà là dans ce tableau, même s'il n'y a pas de personnage masculin. Il y a ce fiancé qui est toujours déjà là par ce tableau. Voilà, est-ce que vous voulez nous parler de ces deux scènes sur ces questions?
Yes, the first thing that the card scene is a very different scene from. It has a very different grammar from the rest of the film, mostly because it's the only scene that is improvised. So, and that's why it's also very. It's the scene that is the most edited in the film, because they're isolated. So it's and I must say it's also the only scene that has some form of link to the riddles of the Sphinx. So I'm really happy. It's that the camera is at the center, because in Laura's film there's a frontality that kind of evokes, Jeanne Dillman and this idea of looking at women frontally. But it's a panoramic at the center. So it's another way to put women at the center. It's to put the camera in the center and look at women. And the wider the room is, the wider you will see them. And that's exactly the same idea. And I think it's the only time it might be the only scene that has some form of echo with that grammar. So I think I see, rather than seeing these two scenes as character talking about the male gaze, because they're flirting. So they're flirting with the idea of what is expected from them, rather than just theoretically discussing. It's a way it's a way to flirt. And those two scenes, they go together, because you see those women for the first time releasing some form of, even though they release some form of they're relaxed and they laugh and they give, and it's the only moment where the actresses, they were giving something of themselves today, and I'm not, it's not the kind of scenes that I don't like shooting those scenes, because as Laura said, I'm very programmatic, because that's what, especially if you're aware that cinema costs so much, like each time I'm interviewed, I'm saying, oh, you're a very programmatic director, like it would be negative. I'm like, I'm a responsible person. What do you expect? This costs 4 million, which is cheap. And would I arrive on the set not knowing what I do? I would, that's it. That would be incompetence, and it would be. So yes, those improvised scenes, they're not the most interesting scenes to talk about regarding the process of thinking an image, but still they're interesting in the process of making an image. So it's really about how you're going to look at them very distinctively, and you want to get something very contemporary stuff there. So basically, I started looking at Adele Haenel, because I knew she had this whole theory about the character being behind the mask. She had been very on her own constructing a proposal that I fully endorsed. But I knew she's a strong player, so I started with her, thinking she wasn't going to play the scene and that she would just be herself. And then, so the scene is on the shoulder of the last actress that you're going to look at, which is Noémie Merlan, because that's after playing like 12 rounds, it's not fun anymore. And so that's when my job starts, because I know what I got from the others. I know about the looks, so I'm like, okay, now we're going to edit the scene, we're going to write the scene with the last character, with her gaze. The other one, they had been playful. There had been also, some form of class interaction that felt weird, because the servant is like teasing a boss. So suddenly, to write the scene, it was all about Noémie Merlan's gaze and the fact that she would make them. She was in charge of the eroticism, because Adele had been playing goofy, and so suddenly she was in charge of that tension. So that's how one gaze can put a scene of fun into suddenly switch the tension. So we weren't looking for that kind of tension until the end, and with one character. I don't know if I'm answering any question there, but I'm talking, I'm saying things, cool anecdotes. And
I think it's very telling of the idea of the gaze that's not hierarchical, but that's more circulation and a back and forth between characters.
Yes, it's a very it became a very, because then when you write it, it doesn't feel that symbolic. But in the process of the grammar of the film that builds itself day after day, those kind of scenes that are also just supposed to be very fun and easy, they become loaded with this language you're building, and that you can't help speaking in a way. And it happens when, I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know what I'm talking about anymore.
I wanted to ask Céline a few questions, so I have to compose myself a bit. Unless there's something more about the question of filming the nude that would relate to Chloe.
It's okay, you can talk.
Yeah. Because I wanted to... It comes back perhaps to a point that Céline made a little bit earlier about the way in which women's history is lost, and it has to be both retrieved and invented, in a sense. And that brings up a more general question, which once again relates to linearity and the a kind of rebellion against the linear, which I think women in their creative activities have actually tried to write or in a different kind of way, in a kind of non-linear way. I'm just hesitating a bit because I kind of want to put in a little bit more of my spectatorial autobiography, and I'm not sure whether it's appropriate, but I'll try and do it. I'll try and give you what in Hollywood they call the high concept version, which is that in the middle of the 1990s, around the time of the centenary of cinema, DVDs came on the market, and I found, although I'd been watching VHS tapes and so on, and playing with them, somehow the arrival of the DVD took me back to some of my old favourites and my old Hollywood movies, but I found that I was looking at them in quite a different way, that these were films I knew quite well. And instead of starting them and watching them all the way through, I began to stop at my favourite moments and watch gestures, looks, relations between characters. But then I started to become more and more aware of film as a temporal medium, not in the sense that it flows forward all the time, which it does, but also the way that it captures time in the past and holds it there. So when you stop a movie, you can suddenly turn it into a photograph which has the moment in which Roland Barthes talks about the ça y était, or whatever it is, whatever.
Ça a été.
Ça a été. And so suddenly the past can kind of flow back into the present of spectatorship. And you get three levels. The one of the level, so in a sense it's a kind of transformation of my three looks. There's the moment when the camera registers the time of the image. There's the moment in the fiction where the fictional moment flows and can be stopped. And then there's the moment when you, as spectator, can play with these different levels of time. And I found, one, this ungendered the cinema, because I could kind of stop it, I could become the person in control, the person with power, but also it made temporality visible. And I was very struck at the end of Portrait d'une jeune femme, by 3 levels of time. I don't know if I'm right about this, so we'll see what Céline has to say, but I'm going to try it. That in a way, that in the relationship between the two women, there's the development of their relationship, as it were, the flow of their relationship in its fictional development. And then there's the moment when they know they're going to part, and they know they're going to never see each other again. And they talk about memory, and what will they remember. And they retell their story, and they turn it, as it were, into the movie of their story. It's going to make me cry. Last shot of the film, on Eloise, you see her remembering. So she then, you can see in a moment, perhaps, yeah. I'll try to manage. So you see her actually running through the time of the whole story and the moments in which she and Marianne have said, so as she weeps, she laughs, and the whole thing goes through her mind. So those levels of time become very complicated, but also I felt that as the camera moves forward towards her, the scene is, for now, for the spectator in the cinema then, and it's no longer for Eloise.
That's exactly right, yes.
Is that true?
Oh, yes. It's a scene that unveils itself as cinema. It's a scene that unveils itself as cinema.
Yes, exactly.
It's not about, identifying with her. It's about mirroring her. It's about being aware, but that's always what we're trying to do, unveiling the fact that it's cinema. You know, it's Chantal Ackerman that used to say, I hate it. For me, it would be the greatest loser if somebody went to see my film and said, I hadn't seen the time pass. That would be a failure, because cinema is about feeling time pass very, very more vividly than ever. And and so it's about feeling, it's about never forgetting that you are in a cinema. And and it's about celebrating the fact that cinema exists and that it's actually talking to you. So it's really a way for me to, unveiling cinema is not to play smart, is to make you active. Because then if you're in if it's official that it's cinema, then and that you're watching it, then it's a mutual look. And I just want to say that I'm very touched about what you said about how DVD changed the way you could have control over the film and the flowing of time. I had the same when I realized that when I watched the film on TV, the same film that I'd been watching, and especially the Bogart film, for instance, Casablanca. I remember the first time that I watched Casablanca on the small screen, which was the first time that I watched Casablanca on TV. I remember that I always felt very moved by the kiss, and that at some point I decided I would take him away. I put my hand on the screen, and the kiss was going on, and I was looking at that woman just be kissed. And that's when I was like, identification sucks. Because so far, because this is better for me. And so far I was like, I have to be him, but I can't. And so the fact that, and that's why we should also be very, very enthusiastic, especially as feminists, with the fact that there's new way of watching. You know, we shouldn't be all about, it's about the big screen, it's about the big screen. The big screen is very authoritative. With my little hand, I can't hide Boggy on the big screen. I can do that, I can hide my eye, but it's not the same. Then I would have one eye.
Could we perhaps just ask everybody here, how many of you experiment with your own spectatorship by stopping, reversing, slowing down. How many could you do? You do? Yeah. Practically everybody. A lot of people, anyway. Put your hands up once more. I think it's about 50-50. No, more than that. Yeah. So it's a very, it's a very thought-provoking experience because you start to think about film as well as enjoy film.
I was just talking about the difference in reception of Céline's film in the English-speaking world as compared to France, and especially that your film was really perceived in these terms of inventing, working around the male gaze. Do you want to
I just want to say anecdotally, my son sent me on International Women's Day. I can't remember what newspaper or journal it came from, but it gave its assessment of the 10 top women directors of the moment. And who was the first? Did you know that? You didn't know that? No.
But
I kept thinking I was looking through because it always starts with 10. And as I knew I was going to see you, I kept thinking, where's Céline? Where's Céline? What's happened to Céline? She's not here. Have they forgotten her?
It happens.
And then she was the top, the number one.
That's good to know. It's good to be at the top.
So that was just
that's fine. And in the French critical world, we still have this very binary opposition between an aesthetic take on films as opposed to cultural studies informed take, and there's a feel that there's not much effort made to combine an aesthetic reflection on films and a sort of conscious take on gender issues and issues of the gaze. What's your take on this intertwining on those two dimensions and reception in France?
My take is let them work. I just leave. No, I don't know how to comment on that. It's just that at some point, Laura Mulvey has written a manifesto, a provocative manifesto, that has opened some questions rather than narrow them down. And it's been 40 years. The fact that here in France, when you kind of evoke that work that they haven't read, it looks like you're narrowing things, whether this article has a 40-year history, and so a lot of dynamics around it. It's just lacking enthusiasm. So it means there's something to be protected. It's a very posh industry, very bourgeois industry. And very, very, and the critic is kind of the same. I don't know how to. I don't even have to explain it. It's just you just read the articles. You just see the appetite. It's because it's not about being right. I don't want to dominate anyone with what I think. I just want to participate. And the fact that it's not a good news, I think the fact that we are not the good news, that this is not the good news, is just sad. It's just lacking joy. What I'm missing is joy. I'm not missing interesting intellectual interaction. We are global, so my relationship with critics is very, very rich. But it's not very interesting to. I mean, poor of us. The fact that suddenly, it will always be. You would always be. I read an article that you did with Le Monde 2 years ago, and the guy goes, "But isn't it narrow to think that isn't art about all being free from gender?" Yeah. Oh my God! So you're like, okay, this was written 40 years ago, and you still have to not to undermine what you thought, but you have to keep the energy down, not be excited. It's a manifesto. It should be exciting. It's not about being right. It's about saying something's wrong. It's very different. And it's about mostly, we all come to this conclusion as a female spectator or a queer spectator that this doesn't feel good. It's not the article that's going to make you feel that. The article is just going to make you feel less lonely when you realize that, because we all realize it at some point. Nobody's stupid. Nobody's in front of the screen just taking it in and being like, it's great. Everyone's feeling at some point that they shouldn't feel bad in front of an image, or that if they're excited, maybe it's all about the image more than themselves. At least you're not lonely when you're making that discovery, because Laura Mulvey was here. Yeah.
Hi, I have a question for Laura. To what extent do you think the dynamics that you were kind of describing about Rudolph Valentino also applied to Rock Hudson and in the Douglas Sirk movies?
Very interesting question. I don't think they... Well, there are a number of points there. Obviously, we now all know that Rock Hudson was gay, and that certainly he had a large following in the gay community, who knew precisely what his sexuality was and kind of laughed at innuendos. But he really flourished in the melodrama genre, which was one of the few and generally rather despised, dismissed as women's weepies. So precisely were not necessarily dominated by the action male. And precisely are more about the domestic space, and very often, as in the Rock Hudson-Jane Wyman pairing, about the older woman, the problem of her sexuality, the problem of the slightly older mother, and so actually addressing questions which mainstream Hollywood didn't address. And so it's very striking that my Visual Pleasure article doesn't even mention these movies, which I was actually extremely fond of. And I'm a big fan of Douglas Sirk, as you can probably imagine. But I was interested in as it were, in writing a manifesto about the voyeuristic gaze. So I wasn't, at that point, writing about melodrama and Rock Hudson. Though, I mean, if you look at the films with Rock Hudson in detail and carefully, and if you stop them again, you can see that he's lit and framed very precisely as well for his beauty, and also for his kind of quite cinematic beauty. And I think perhaps rather particularly in All That Heaven Allows, some of the scenes, the lighting in All That Heaven Allows is quite remarkable. Does that answer anything? Yeah.
A lot of sneer and snipe goes to American cinema. And my question is, what about Old Blighty?
I can't hear.
I said, yeah. I said a lot of sneer snipe goes to American cinema. My question is, what about Old Blighty? What about England? What about England? You talk about America. What about England?
We talked about Hollywood film. What about British films?
No, you answer first. That's a very good question. And I can only really answer it by going back to that historical moment of the 1960s, perhaps almost before the 1970s, when my generation of leftists, perhaps we left university in the early 60s, and we, in some kind of Oedipal way, we rebelled against what we might call Englishness. And when I say Englishness, I mean it with all the class and imperial connotations that word has. And we reacted against our own culture, and we reacted against the kind of parochial self-satisfaction that you saw in Englishness, and which we've seen tragically reenacted in the last few years. Extraordinarily disastrous time for my country. And we reacted in a cultural way, by adopting the two cultures that were most distrusted by Englishness. One was American popular culture, and the other was French ideas. The invasion of American popular culture was looked on with enormous suspicion by Englishness. And the idea of continental ideas coming in and contaminating our precious traditions was looked on again with enormous suspicion. So we just thought, French ideas, American popular culture, what a wonderful combination. And it's all there in the Cahiers du Cinéma anyway. So we went to Hollywood movies, and French ideas started to be translated and had a big impact on my generation. Now, later, and to a certain extent, we kind of rather dismissed English cinema. Again, what was it? Was it Truffaut who said, "Cinema and England, what an oxymoron." No such thing. But actually, there are wonderful British films. Thinking historically, there's Powell and Pressburger. And there's some wonderful B movies of the 1940s and 50s. And there's a lot of British films being made now. There are interesting women directors emerging. So I try and take a kind of less antagonistic line now.
Did you feel European at the time?
What?
Did you feel European at the time?
Of course. But I mean, that's partly my family background. I was expected to learn French. And then I was expected to learn Italian, actually.
You learned those two languages as a kid? You learned as a kid French?
I was just sent to France and then sent to Italy until I wasn't considered very, very doué. But it was it wasn't a dominant English tradition.
What role do you think director of photography and maybe female director of photography play into creating something else than a male gaze? So yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. This goes back to your wanting to talk about your DOP.
Oh, I could talk about Diane. Yeah, in those days, one could only be a cinematographer if accredited by the union, and it was very difficult to get union credit. And she managed to get it through a television program that she was working on. So there were only two women cinematographers working in Britain in those days. And she was a recent graduate from the National Film School, and a friend of ours told us about her because we were very anxious to have a woman cinematographer. And and she was the most extraordinarily determined and inventive camera woman. But my anecdote really is this, that Peter and I, in our programmatic way, had decided that we wanted to shoot the main part of the film, the little story section of the film, with 360-degree pans, because of the way in which it extended the duration of the shot and also avoided the problem of editing, because the camera edited itself. It just closed the circle. And that wasn't, in a sense, an authorial decision. It was the camera's own decision. And also because, precisely as Céline was describing just now, it gives that kind of panoramic sense of where the camera is. Anyway, so when we first met Diane, or very soon after we first met Diane, we said we want to shoot the film in this kind of way. And realizing years afterwards the level of naivete to say we want to shoot in 360-degree pans, we had no idea the complexity of this task and how difficult it was. And in fact, it involved a kind of geared head, all kinds of bits of equipment, and Diane kind of turning the handle. And also she had to move round a platform which she couldn't see. She had to move with her feet round, and she had to develop a kind of sway in her body so that she could keep the rhythm of the camera and the shot going. So it was a really so I always like to have a tribute in terms of Riddles of the Sphinx, the extraordinary achievement of our cinematographer really kind of made the film. So when I talk about collaboration, it's a very real, it really is collaboration. And I think it's very important that these credits get spread. And I think one aspect of the investigations into women's film history has been to try and uncover ways in which women participated in filmmaking that have become invisible or disappeared. So, for instance, continuity, editing, design, costume, these ways in which women did actually put the image on the screen, which have been very overlooked, and now being researched and given more credit. Just to say about spectatorship, all those ways in which theorists have kind of deconstructed the gaze and thought about different kinds of spectatorship and degenderizing the gaze, also relates to something that Chloe and I were talking about earlier, which is the question of the curious gaze. So I wondered if you might say something about...
Yeah, well, that was a question I wanted to ask you. But yes, you. I was interested in some question about criticism and how maybe both of you receive critics. I mean, like interesting ones. So when you published this famous article, Visual Pleasure and Narrative Cinema, it opened a huge discussion about how to invent alternative ways to develop other ways of looking, of seeing, of staging bodies, and you received many critics about this article. One of them, for example, I just quote one of them, was Bell Hooks' discussion about the gaze and for the white dimension of the male gaze, which you didn't have mentioned. Oh, comment on conjugue tout ça? Well, you didn't mention that in the first article, and she was developing this very interesting discussion about how African American female spectators could relate to this male gaze industry, and she was saying that they couldn't identify to the female characters on the screen because unless they were kind of denying themselves, you know. And she crafted this word of oppositional gaze, and maybe this was my question. How did you? No, my real question is that was another proposal, for example, of what kind of gaze you can't develop, and you kind of responded to all these critics by developing this concept of curiosity, which is a kind of response to fetishism. Like fetishism is a way of dissimulating anxiety in relation to the female body behind symbols and very fascinating images. And curiosity is a way to return to the female subject as a subject of inquiry, you said. So that was something I wanted to ask you, like, how do you see this curiosity method now. And I also related to the subject of humor. You were talking about humor, like more active behaviors for female spectatorship, maybe. It's not a question, it's kind of huge monologue, sorry.
I think it's important to realize that Hollywood cinema was very much an apartheid cinema, that there were many opportunities when the very, very talented black performers that were around, particularly at the time of the coming of sound, when during the 1920s, with the rise of African-American presence on radio, on records, on performance, on Broadway, had really become quite considerable, that it's very striking that they weren't adopted by the cinema and that Hollywood stayed more or less white. A few films were made of African-American only casts. Some of them are really remarkable. But what's really remarkable is the absolute lack of African-American talent on the screen. And I think Bell Hooks was absolutely right when she pointed out that the kind of what I had to experience as a discovery of an oppositional gaze was something that the African-American had had forever. And she puts that very well and very clearly. She said, white women had to discover this. We knew it all the time. And that's obviously very much, I mean, she puts it very beautifully. I haven't done it quite so well. But again, very much, I mean, I suppose I would just end that by just that bit, just by saying that it's just such a tragedy that so much talent was ignored for so long. And it's a loss to humankind, really. Both, you know, the ways in which the marginalization of cultures that weren't acceptable to the dominant is tragic. About curiosity, I suppose it was a way of trying to rather than saying no, I suppose I could put it like this. Perhaps it's another mythologization, because perhaps it's again going back to mythology, using Pandora's curiosity, Pandora wanting to see in the box, this desire to see, but also to see with the mind's eye, as well as just seeing, as it were, with the eye. And the desire to solve riddles, to solve puzzles. So generally a play with curiosity, as well as the curiosity as an epistemological drive. And just an interest in the way that curiosity had been associated with women, again, slightly considered to be slightly feminine, slightly off main culture, not very male, not very much to do with high culture, to do with, as it were, gossip, women's lower culture, women's knowledges, all those areas in which women have been marginalized. And so I thought curiosity was a way of reviving those mythologies, and also thinking about how that even in a minor form of literature, the detective story, women tended to have more presence than in other kinds of literature. But there was one problem with curiosity, which I felt that it was completely, and this comes back to something that Céline said earlier. Curiosity, in a sense, is kind of a desexualized epistemological desire to know. So in that sense, it's kind of purely...
Is it really?
What?
Is it really?
Well, go on, you say.
Well, is curiosity dissectionized?
When I was coming up with it as the opposite of fetishism, I think I kind of... No, you can have sexual curiosity, of course. Mm-hmm. You're quite right. Go on, Claudia, go on.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that the desire to investigate, to sort of puzzle, also has a maybe an erotic drive in it, which is not sexualized in the sense of, in the meaning of genital, but which has to do with desire. Well, I think I experiment it in research all the time. And maybe you also do.
Yeah. But I suppose I just wanted to say our desire to know and our desire to, and that there's a pleasure in the desire to know, but also there's a pleasure in solving puzzles, riddles, children's games, again,
Maybe, Céline, do you make a relationship between this curiosity question and humor, the question of humor, which you raised?
The link I do mostly is the fact that it's curiosity and women character and kids character. I think, apart from our own libido with curiosity, but in matter of representation, women and kids, they are the curious character because they don't have the infos. And that's why I really like to write hit characters, because I feel like the tension of them looking is vital. So you don't have to justify the fact that they're curious, because that's their way of surviving, looking at their context, their parents, where am I, who is this, and so I think it's also the character under some form of threat, which is the threat is not having autonomy, not making your own choices. They are curious because they are looking, for the exit all the time. And I think that's the vulnerability of characters who are not in charge and not in power. It shows their vulnerability, and it shows also their survival mode. And that's why maybe, yes, the great investigators or great are women. Miss Marple. And Hercule Poirot was the male avatar of Agatha Christie is a very, very feminized man. Once you're curious, you're feminized.
Even Sherlock Holmes is quite feminine.
Yeah.
Or rather, he's not feminine, he's not very masculine. I think.
Oui, je voulais juste revenir très rapidement sur
But that
Portrait.
would take us back to Petite Maman and the curiosity there, but we could come back if there are other questions.
Je voulais juste revenir très rapidement sur Portrait, sur une phrase que vous avez dite, Céline Sciamma, vous avez dit ce n'est pas une utopie parce que cette relation aurait pu exister ou a existé. Et je voulais juste savoir si vous ne pensiez pas que dans l'utopie, enfin en tout cas dans le film, il y a une démarche utopique quand même dans la croyance en cette relation et le fait qu'elle le vivent. Donc il y a cette démarche utopique chez les personnages, mais aussi dans le projet du film, et même en termes d'espace, le caractère insulaire du film est je pense très important et sûrement à l'origine du projet. Donc est-ce que l'utopie est pas aussi est-ce qu'on pourrait pas aussi le placer au centre du projet du film?
Oui, vous avez raison, mais les utopies, moi je pense que il faut un contexte pour que les utopies soient propices. Donc effectivement, j'ai chargé la barque pour que deux femmes vraiment s'aiment sans problème. Bon, il y a une île, il n'y a pas d'hommes, tout ça pour créer le contexte de l'utopie. Mais l'utopie, il faut avoir l'opportunité de vivre ces utopies. C'est pour ça que souvent c'est la bourgeoisie qui peut vivre des utopies pas chères aussi, souvent, parce qu'on a les moyens de créer des communautés. Mais toutes les utopies se font. Quand je dis que ça aurait pu exister, c'est que ça a existé. Toutes les utopies existent. C'est-à-dire en France ces temps-ci, il y a plein d'utopies vivantes, vécues par des gens et dans des contextes en fait. Donc moi je crois pas que l'utopie, qu'on mette en scène l'utopie, il faut mettre en scène l'utopie, c'est arriver à Oui, à créer le contexte où on va pouvoir tout à fait croire on rentre en intimité avec une utopie. Voilà, parce qu'en fait, pour moi, la question de la plausibilité ou du réalisme de ce qu'on regarde au cinéma, c'est de se dire c'est la vraisemblance, quoi. Et c'est d'arriver à se dire je suis en intimité avec ça, donc c'est vrai. Voilà, pour moi c'est ça la vérité au cinéma. C'est si on se sent en intimité, on se dit mais oui c'est vrai, je me sens proche de ça, alors ça existe, quoi. Et ça vient forcément et c'est évident. Mais surtout, même historiquement, il y a eu des communautés de femmes toujours, les béguines, enfin, donc on n'a aucun mal à imaginer que c'est possible. Mais par contre, il faut beaucoup travailler le contexte de l'utopie pour qu'on y croie et qu'on soit en intimité avec ça, et aussi qu'on soit inspiré. C'est-à-dire pour sa propre utopie, dans son réel, dans son contexte. Donc oui, l'utopie, elle est au centre parce que on va définir les règles du jeu qui vont nous permettre le plus possible de donner de tout son corps à cette utopie vécue. You said a lot of things, and I'm not going to go into details where, but I don't think I'm making referential cinema. I'm never thinking about films made by other people. Actually, there's just one I just quoted once. Bergman in Portrait of a Lady on Fire, but it's actually the only time I think about directors, but I never think about films. I think about Chantal Akerman, for instance, for Petite Maman, I thought about Chantal Akerman and Miyazaki, but that didn't thought about this frame from Chantal Akerman and this idea from Miyazaki. I just thought about how, I don't know, for instance, for Miyazaki, how nobody would say he's making cinema for kids and the rooms are full of kids. And so it means, like, how do you make very democratic cinema? He has the answer to this, for instance. Doesn't mean he has the... So it's this kind of dialogues that I have with film is the one that I'm trying to bring on screen for you. So really not about some form of cinephilia, some form of scopophilia, some form of references and stuff like that. Really much more about the relationship between the film and the ideas of the film and you watching them, which means that it's more and more experimental, because I believe more and more in the impact of images, which is also, the good side of this moment of horror, when you realize that films are actually being dictating you stuff and that you were not aware. And that this moment of shock, when you discover that, there are people behind this, their brain. At least you're fully aware, not that you've been in this big scam, but fully aware of the power of images and the impact of images, because those images, they've had such an impact on you. So once you realize that it was all planned, not the impact, but to have one, then you can also say, okay, so I can do that too. It's really powerful. It's a really powerful tool. If I, a queer kid, was like really trying to wear high heels and please my mother, it's really powerful, very it could domesticate me, maybe, but also save me, because then you know about the impact. So to me, it's really much more about trusting more and more the impact that you want to have, which means really being obsessed about the public. And you're saying, and I'm not thinking about what you love or what you want, but I'm thinking about your body in the room, and that it should go to some form of state transformation for an hour and 10 minutes, and that maybe this transformation will have an impact on life, because, if I always thought, well, I want a mother and a kid watching Petite Maman together, and then the film ends, and they get out, and the bus is there, so they have to run, and they run differently. That's the impact I want to have. So it's not about cinema, it's about feeling your body differently, because at some point in the film you created doors where people in the room felt equally respected, even though they're very different, like a kid and an adult, for instance. Then suddenly it has an impact. Maybe just in the room, and you leave the movie in the room. And if you want it to have an impact in the world, then you take the film in your pocket. That's why you make them small, very small, pocket films.
En fait, j'ai trouvé ça très beau quand vous avez parlé de Casablanca et du fait de cacher le visage de Humphrey Bogart et d'avoir une nouvelle vision finalement de ce film et du cinéma. Est-ce que vous considérez que Portrait de la jeune fille en feu, c'est un film que vous avez rêvé à partir de ce que vous avez en fait, enfin cette vision s'est construite à partir de ce que vous avez vu au cinéma depuis toute jeune. Donc est-ce que c'est un peu votre film rêvé presque qu'on a en tête dès l'enfance, je dirais? Ou est-ce que c'est un film qui s'est fait d'une manière évolutive, ou en fait parce que il est sorti à un moment, c'est extrêmement intéressant en fait le moment où il est sorti avec tout ce qui s'est passé au niveau de la nouvelle vague de féminisme, etc. Donc est-ce que vous avez l'impression d'avoir été plus influencé par une époque, des 10 dernières années, ou est-ce que c'est votre film de toujours presque que vous avez toujours rêvé de faire?
Non, je pense que c'est mauvais signe d'avoir un film à faire depuis toujours. Enfin, quand on a eu comme moi l'opportunité d'en faire, en tout cas, hein, évidemment. Donc non, moi je pense on donne toujours des nouvelles du présent, de soi au présent, enfin c'est même pas forcément donner des nouvelles, parfois c'est même s'espérer dans le futur, quoi. C'est en fait on écrit quelque chose qu'on voudrait être, quoi. Donc non, pour le coup, moi j'ai aucun fétichisme. J'ai été une très grande fétichiste du cinéma et je le suis plus du tout. Voilà. Et donc y compris dans ma pratique, hein. Et c'est très agréable par ailleurs de ne pas être dans l'obsession, d'être dans l'amitié comme ça avec le cinéma. Ça me plaît beaucoup plus que d'avoir été si amoureuse. Ouais.
Ouais, c'est juste une petite question sur les alternatives possibles à ce male gaze. Je me demandais, puisque j'ai le sentiment que le male gaze, c'est un modèle où la charge érotique, elle est essentiellement assumée par le corps féminin. Et je me demandais ce que vous pensiez des possibilités offertes par, la dissémination de cette charge érotique à d'autres êtres, comme par exemple les êtres végétaux, les êtres minéraux, etc. Ou les objets inertes, comme peuvent faire Cronenberg ou Mandico. Voilà, qu'est-ce que vous pensez de ça?
Je pense qu'on l'a déjà fait. Je pense que l'histoire de la langue des femmes, c'est un rapport justement c'est un rapport de fluidité entre d'une libido qui court parce qu'elle est imaginaire. Donc l'avantage d'une libido imaginaire, c'est qu'elle va partout. Et on peut dire que Jane Campion, si le piano, c'est pas un objet de libido incroyable. Donc je crois qu'on est les reines de ça, hein. Enfin, dans le sens par obligation, quoi. Donc il faudrait pas perdre la main là-dessus, dans le sens pas la main, dans le sens qu'on dominerait la question, mais cette culture de faire circuler, je pense qu'on et sans dépolitiser ça, c'est très important, quoi. Attention. Bon, attention à pas dépolitiser la nature au cinéma aussi, et tous les êtres vivants. Moi, there's a film that the most incredible film that I saw this year and that I saw in my life is the next Andrea Arnold film called Cow, which could be considered the first eco-feminist movie. Obviously, it's not because it hasn't been translated, but it does exist. But I think it will answer your question, and it's not about sexuality, but it's about everything. It's groundbreaking regarding how do you make the portrait of an animal. You should all watch it very soon.
I haven't seen it, unfortunately.
You have to,
I look forward to it.
You're going to adore it.
Yeah.
I'm sure.
Merci à toutes les deux. Thank you so much. Would you like to add anything? Or?
I think he's finished. Yeah. I was just going to say something to you. Well, I could just finish by saying, quickly saying something about Petite Maman, because we didn't talk about it at all. And it seemed to me that it opened up these questions of time and women's time, without going in detail, because now we've finished our session, really. But it means that that the whole idea that time has to be consecutive kind of disappears into the dream of the child's curiosity and her curiosity about her mother, but also the way in which the mother-child relationship is in some way outside patriarchal time or is inside its own time. And it's also a time of play. And from the point of view of Riddles of the Sphinx and trying to open up a pre-Oedipal temporality, it's also to insist that, unlike Jacques Lacan, who says that language is the language of the patriarchy and that law is the law of the father, actually signification, meaning, come out of play and out of fun. And the child that Freud talks about, who played with his little cotton reel and threw it outside his cot and brought it back, charting the absence and the return of his mother, was signifying. And so meaning comes as much out of the body and the relationship of the mother as it does out of patriarchal society. And I think that's there in Petite Maman very much. I think it's a film that actually takes our culture back to that very important point, which both, as it were, challenges the Oedipal trajectory, but also challenges our everyday understanding of temporality.
Thank you for understanding everything so well.
Thank you again. Merci à vous de votre présence et de votre participation.